I knew the exact second everything was about to fall apart, because the ground changed before the people did. It was 6:12 in the morning when the first RV engine coughed to life, a low diesel growl rolling across my pasture like distant thunder, followed by another, and another, until the quiet Texas air turned into a parking lot symphony of idling engines, slamming doors, and laughter that didn't belong there. I was standing by my fence line, boots pressed into soil my grandfather broke with his own hands, watching headlights stretch across 40 acres of land that legally, unquestionably, belonged to me. 500 campers. That's what the flyer said. 500 strangers invited onto my property like it was some kind of public park. The smell hit next. Burnt propane, cheap coffee, synthetic tent fabric heating under the early sun. None of it right. None of it supposed to be here. And right in the center of it all, nailed to one of my own fence posts, was a bright white sign that read, Willow Creek HOA Family Camp Festival. Like they'd already rewritten reality overnight. My name is Caleb Turner, and I've spent the last 15 years building this ranch back from nothing but debt, drought, and broken fences. My cattle aren't just livestock. They're how I pay my taxes, how I keep the lights on, how I hold on to the last piece of land my family ever owned. Especially the bulls. Big, stubborn, territorial animals that don't take kindly to noise, crowds, or strangers wandering too close to their space. And yet here we were. Kids running across grazing lines. Campfires being stacked less than 50 yards from my holding gates. People setting up folding chairs like they bought tickets to something I never agreed to host. I didn't say a word at first. I just watched. Because I'd seen this coming, just not like this. The HOA president, Brenda Whitaker, had been circling my property for months, talking about community integration and shared land potential, like she had any say in what happened past my fence. She smiled when she said it, too, like she was offering me a favor instead of a warning. I told her no. Clearly. Legally. Repeatedly. But Karen types like Brenda don't hear no. They hear not yet. So she went around me, organized her event, sent out invites, printed signs, and now 500 people were standing on my land, acting like they had every right to be there. I pulled my hat down against the rising sun and listened closer. Music starting up. Someone cheering. A kid laughing near the east fence, the one closest to the bull enclosure. That's when I noticed the rocks. Small ones at first, then bigger, tossed at the fence like it was a game. The metal wires rang out with each hit, sharp, hollow pings that traveled farther than those kids realized. And behind that fence, I heard it. A shift. Heavy. Slow. Alert. The kind of movement you don't ignore if you've spent your life around animals that think in instinct, not intention. I exhaled, tasting dust, and something sharper underneath it. Not anger. Not panic. Something quieter. Something colder. Because right then, standing there with 500 uninvited guests turning my ranch into their weekend getaway, I realized something simple. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to shout. I didn't even need to call the cops. I just needed to let my land respond. I have been around land long enough to know when something is wrong, not because someone tells you, but because everything else does. The wind does not move the same when a place is crowded. The birds do not sit on the fence. Even the grass feels different under your boots, like it is being pressed into something it does not recognize. I walked along the fence line slow, counting steps the way my father taught me when I was a kid, heel to toe, steady, controlled, like you respect the ground before you try to control it. My grandfather used to say this land remembers everything. Every storm, every drought, every hoofprint. And right now it was remembering 500 strangers treating it like a weekend rental. A man in a folding chair raised his coffee cup at me like we were neighbors. Someone else waved and asked where the restroom area was. I did not answer. I just kept walking. Because this was not confusion. This was assumption. An assumption is what gets people into trouble out here. I passed the north gate first. Chain still locked. Good. That one leads straight into the lower pasture where the younger cattle graze. They were already uneasy, shifting in loose clusters, ears flicking toward the noise. Too many sounds, too many unfamiliar scents. I could hear a generator kick on behind me, followed by a burst of country music that did not belong on my land unless I turned it on myself. That was the rule here. Always had been. I reached the main holding fence and rested my hand against the metal. Warm already from the sun. Solid. Reliable. On the other side, about 70 yards out, the bulls were standing still. Not grazing, not moving, just watching. That is what most people do not understand about animals like that. They do not react first. They observe. They calculate in their own way. Every shift of movement, every sound, every vibration through the ground. And right now, they were taking everything in. The laughter, the engines, the footsteps, the rocks hitting the fence. Another sharp ping rang out, louder this time, and I saw one of the younger campers near the east line toss another stone, grinning like he had discovered something entertaining. I felt my jaw tighten, not from anger, but from recognition. This was the moment things crossed from inconvenience into consequence. I turned and looked across the field again, really looked this time. RVs parked uneven across grazing paths. Coolers stacked where water runoff normally flows. A fire pit being dug 10 yards from a drainage line that took me 2 summers to restore. And right in the center of it all, Brenda Whitaker stood like she was hosting a ribbon-cutting ceremony, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, giving directions like she owned every acre she could see. I watched her for a long second. The way she pointed, the way people listened, the confidence of someone who has never had to deal with real consequences before. That kind of confidence always has an expiration date. I shifted my weight and reached into my pocket, pulling out the small brass key that opened the secondary latch on the east gate. It felt heavier than it should have. Or maybe I just understood exactly what it meant. Not revenge, not anger, just balance. Out here, you do not force order. You let nature correct what does not belong. And right now, everything on this land was out of place except one thing. I took a slow breath, tasting dust, diesel, and something older underneath it all. Something steady, something that had been here long before any homeowners association ever printed a flyer. Then I started walking toward the gate. I could hear my own footsteps over everything else as I moved toward the east gate, each step steady, measured, like I was walking into something I had already decided hours ago. The noise behind me kept building, laughter mixing with music, someone revving an engine for no reason other than showing off. The kind of careless energy that only shows up when people think there are no consequences. The chain on the gate rattled lightly as the breeze shifted, a small metallic sound that most people would ignore, but to me it sounded like a countdown. I stopped a few feet away and looked back one more time, not because I was hesitating, but because I wanted to remember exactly how it looked before everything changed. 500 people scattered across land they did not understand. Camp chairs planted where cattle trails ran for decades. Coolers sitting on top of soil that took years to recover after the last drought. And Brenda, still moving through it all like she was orchestrating something impressive, pointing, smiling, completely blind to the fact that she had built her little event on top of something she did not control. I crouched down near the fence post and pressed my hand against the ground for a second. You learn to do that after enough years out here. Feel the vibration. Feel the movement. The earth does not lie. And right then, I could feel it. Low, steady, shifting weight from the other side of the fence. The bulls were restless now. Not aggressive. Not wild. Just aware. Their world had changed in less than an hour, and they were adjusting the only way they knew how. I stood back up and reached for the lock. The brass key slid in smooth, worn down from years of use, turning with a quiet click that felt louder than it should have. I wrapped my hand around the chain and paused, not because I was unsure, but because timing matters. Always has. You do not open a gate because you are angry. You open it because it is the right moment. Another rock hit the fence behind me, louder this time, followed by a burst of laughter that carried farther than the person throwing it probably realized. That sound traveled straight across the pasture, straight to the herd. I heard a shift in response. Subtle, heavy, intentional. I exhaled slowly and pulled the chain free. The metal links slid against each other with a dry scraping sound, the kind that sticks in your ears longer than it should. The gate itself was old but solid, built to hold pressure, not chaos. I gripped the handle and pushed it open just a few inches at first, letting it creak, letting the sound carry naturally instead of forcing anything. No sudden moves. No noise that would startle. Just space. That is all it takes sometimes. Space for things to move the way they are meant to. I stepped back from the opening and leaned against the post, arms relaxed at my sides, eyes scanning the field. Most of the campers had not noticed anything yet. They were still busy with their morning routines, coffee brewing, tents being adjusted, conversations about weekend plans. Normal behavior in a place that was not normal for them. But the closer ones near the east line started to slow down. A woman turned her head, squinting toward the fence. A man lowered his drink halfway to his mouth and paused. That is how it begins. Not with panic, with confusion, with the quiet realization that something is different. I kept my eyes on the herd. A few of them had already stepped forward, not rushing, not charging, just moving with purpose, muscles shifting under thick hides, heads low, ears locked onto the unfamiliar sounds ahead. The ground responded before the people did, a faint tremor you could feel through your boots if you knew what to look for. I adjusted my stance and took one step farther back from the gate, giving the opening exactly what it needed. Not too wide, not too narrow. Enough. Because out here, you do not control the outcome. You set the conditions, and you let the land do the rest. I did not move as the first one stepped through the opening, slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. And in a way, it did, because out here nothing rushes unless it has to. The sunlight caught along the curve of its back as it crossed the threshold, hooves pressing into dirt that had just been trampled by folding chairs and tire tracks, reclaiming space without asking permission. Another followed, then another, not in a line, not in chaos, just a steady expansion, like water finding its level. The shift was almost quiet at first, more felt than heard, a low rhythm through the ground that did not match the artificial noise still drifting from the campers. But people started noticing. You could see it in the way conversations paused mid-sentence, in the way heads turned just a little too slowly, like their brains had not caught up to their instincts yet. A man near a cooler stood up halfway, squinting toward the field, then fully, his posture tightening without him even realizing it. A woman grabbed her child's hand, not pulling, just holding a little firmer, her smile fading into something uncertain. The music kept playing for another 10 seconds, maybe 15, before someone finally reached over and turned it down, not off, just down, like lowering the volume could somehow make sense of what they were seeing. I leaned against the fence post and watched it unfold, calm, steady, the same way I had watched storms roll in from miles away. No shouting, no sudden movement, just the natural order of things reintroducing itself to a place that had been forced out of balance. The bulls spread out across the pasture, not targeting anything, not chasing, just moving, filling space that had always been theirs, their presence alone enough to change the air. You could feel it even from where I stood, that invisible line shifting, pushing people back without a single word spoken. Camp chairs got folded quicker now. Coolers snapped shut. Someone tried to laugh it off, a short, forced sound that died halfway through when no one joined in. Engines started again, one by one, not revving this time, just turning over, the sound of people, deciding they had somewhere else to be. And right in the middle of it all, Brenda finally stopped moving. The clipboard lowered. The smile disappeared. She stood there, perfectly still, like she was waiting for someone else to take control of a situation that had never belonged to her in the first place. Our eyes met across the distance for a brief second, and I saw it. The moment realization replaced confidence. Not panic. Not yet. Just the understanding that this was not something she could manage with a meeting, a rule, or a printed sign. I pushed myself off the fence and adjusted my hat, taking a slow step forward, not toward her, not toward anyone. Just back onto my land the way I always had, the way I always would. Around me, the rhythm of the place settled into something familiar again, not silent, not empty, but honest. The kind of quiet that does not need permission. And as more people began packing up, moving their things, clearing out the space they had borrowed without asking, I did not say a word. I did not need to, because out here, the message had already been delivered, clear and simple, carried through the ground, through the air, through every instinct they could not ignore. This was never a campground, and it was never theirs to take. The sound changed first, not louder, just different, like the entire field had taken a breath and decided it was done pretending. Doors shut faster now, sharper, more urgent. The slow rhythm of engines turning over became a steady chorus, one after another, like dominoes falling in reverse as people tried to reclaim control of a situation they had never owned. I watched a man fumble with a folding table, his hands moving too quickly, knocking over a thermos that spilled dark coffee into the dust. He did not even look at it. He just kept packing. That is what happens when comfort turns into uncertainty. People stop caring about the small things. A woman nearby struggled to collapse her canopy, the fabric snapping in the wind as she pulled at it, her movements tight, controlled, like she was trying not to draw attention to the fact that she was leaving early. No one announced anything. No one gave instructions. The event just unraveled. Quietly. Naturally. The bulls continued moving across the pasture, not rushing, not reacting, just existing in the space they had always occupied, their presence alone enough to redraw invisible boundaries that no sign or clipboard could override. I stepped further into the field, boots pressing into soil that already felt more familiar under the shifting weight. The air itself seemed to settle, less cluttered, less forced. That artificial energy from earlier, the noise, the assumption, the entitlement, it was fading, replaced by something real, something honest. I could see tire tracks already cutting new paths as RVs began pulling out one by one, careful at first, then faster as more followed, like they were trying to beat each other to the exit. A truck near the west side hesitated too long and got boxed in by another trying to leave, the drivers exchanging quick gestures, no yelling, just that tight, controlled urgency people use when they know they need to move. I kept walking, slow and steady, not directing, not interfering, just present. Because this was not about forcing anyone out. It was about reminding them they never belonged here to begin with. And then there was Brenda. She stood exactly where I had last seen her, but everything about her posture had changed. The clipboard was still in her hand, but it hung lower now, like it had lost whatever authority she thought it carried. Her shoulders were stiff, her stance fixed, like she was trying to hold on to control through sheer will. I approached just close enough for my voice to carry without raising it. "You should probably clear them out," I said, calm, even, like I was commenting on the weather. She looked at me, really looked this time, not through me, not past me, but at me, and for the first time since I had known her, she did not have a response ready. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again, her eyes shifting briefly toward the field, toward the movement, toward the reality she could no longer manage. "This is private property," I added, not as a warning, not as a threat, just a fact placed exactly where it belonged. She swallowed, a small movement, but noticeable, and nodded once, quick, almost reflexive, like her body understood something her pride was still catching up to. Around us, the last of the campers were already packing, already leaving, already rewriting their version of the morning into something simpler, something safer. I turned away before she could say anything else, because there was nothing left to say. The land had already spoken, and it did not need translation. Behind me, the engines grew more distant, the laughter replaced by the low hum of tires on gravel fading into the horizon. And step by step, acre by acre, the place returned to what it had always been, long before anyone thought they could turn it into something else. By late morning, the last engine noise faded past the tree line, leaving behind a kind of silence that only shows up after something artificial has been stripped away. It was not empty. It was reset. I stood near the center of the pasture and listened to it settle, the wind moving through open space again, uninterrupted, the low rustle of grass returning to its normal rhythm. The ground still held the marks of what had happened. Tire tracks pressed deep in places they should never have reached, flattened patches where tents had stood, scattered bits of trash that did not belong to this land or any land that respected itself. I walked slowly across it, not rushing, not reacting, just taking inventory the way you do when something has passed through your property and you need to understand what is left behind. A crushed soda can near the drainage line. A broken plastic stake half buried in the dirt. A circle of dark ash where someone had decided fire was a good idea without knowing what lived under the surface. I crouched down and brushed my hand across the soil, feeling the texture, the moisture, checking for damage the way my father used to after every storm. It would recover. It always does. Land is patient like that. More patient than people. Behind me, the bulls had already spread out again, returning to their usual patterns, the tension gone, replaced by the steady, predictable movement that told me everything was back where it belonged. They did not need instructions. They did not need reassurance. They just needed their space back. I stood up and turned toward the east gate, still open, the chain hanging loose against the post. I walked over and grabbed it, the metal warm under my fingers, and pulled the gate closed with a firm, controlled motion. The latch clicked into place with a sound that felt final, not dramatic, just correct. That is the difference between chaos and order out here. One is loud and temporary. The other is quiet and permanent. I secured the chain and slid the lock back through, turning the key until it stopped. No hesitation. No second thought. Just routine. I slipped the key back into my pocket and rested my hand on the top rail of the fence, looking out across the pasture one more time. The sign was still there, the one they had nailed into my fence, bright white, clean, untouched by everything that had just happened. I walked over to it and pulled it free, the nails resisting for a second before giving way with a dry crack. I held it up, reading the printed words again, the bold letters that had tried to claim something that was never theirs. Then I turned it over and set it face down in the dirt where it belonged. Not destroyed, not broken, just removed from where it should not have been. That is how you deal with things like that. You do not overreact. You correct them. A truck drove past on the road a quarter-mile out. Its sound distant, normal, part of the world outside my fence. Inside, everything was back to the way it should be. No crowds. No noise that did not belong. Just land doing what land does when you let it exist without interference. I adjusted my hat and took a slow breath. The air cleaner now, free of the mix of fuel and distraction that had hung over it earlier. There was still work to do. There always is. But the important part was already handled. Balance had been restored, not by force, not by argument, but by letting the truth of the place speak for itself. And out here, that truth does not need to be explained. It just needs to be respected. By noon, the sun sat high enough to flatten every shadow across the pasture, exposing everything the morning had tried to hide. There is a difference between something that passes through land and something that belongs to it, and you can see it in what gets left behind. I moved along the fence line again, slower this time, not because I was tired, but because this part matters. Anyone can react. Not everyone cleans up properly. The soil near the west edge had been packed down harder than I liked, tire ruts cutting across a grazing path that had taken years to establish. I stepped into one of the tracks and pressed my boot into it, testing the depth, the density, measuring in a way that did not need numbers. It would need time. Maybe a few weeks of rest. Maybe more. I made a mental note without writing anything down. That is how I have always done it. You remember what matters when you live on it. A torn piece of plastic caught on a low branch near the drainage dip, snapping softly in the breeze like it was trying to pretend it belonged there. I pulled it free and folded it once before dropping it into the back pocket of my jeans. No rush. No frustration. Just removal. Piece by piece. The bulls had drifted farther south now, back toward the shade line where the ground dips slightly and holds moisture longer into the afternoon. Their movement was calm again, predictable, the kind of quiet rhythm that tells you the disturbance is over. That is how you measure success out here. Not by noise, not by reaction, but by how quickly things return to normal. I reached the corner post near the gravel access path and paused, looking out toward the road where the last of the dust had finally settled. No vehicles, no movement, just open space between here and the tree line. For a moment, it looked like nothing had happened at all, but I knew better. Land always remembers, even when it forgives. I leaned against the post and pulled out my phone, not to call anyone, not to report anything, but to scroll through the camera feed I had set up months ago along the east fence. The footage played back smooth and steady. Early morning light. RVs rolling in. People unloading chairs, coolers, tents. Brenda walking through it all with that same controlled confidence she had worn like armor. And then the shift. The moment the field changed. Not dramatic. Not chaotic. Just real. The way people paused. The way they looked around. The way the entire energy of the place adjusted without a single command. I watched it once, then again, not for satisfaction, but for clarity. Because documentation matters. Out here, memory is strong, but proof is stronger. I locked the phone and slipped it back into my pocket, eyes moving across the pasture one more time. The grass would recover. The soil would settle. The paths would reform under the right pressure. That is what happens when something real replaces something forced. I adjusted my hat and stepped off the post, heading back toward the house with the same steady pace I had started with that morning. No rush, no victory lap, just routine returning to its place. Behind me, the land continued without interruption, exactly as it had long before anyone thought they could use it for something else. And that is the part most people never understand. You do not win against people like Brenda by arguing louder or pushing harder. You let them step into a place they do not understand, and then you let that place remind them exactly where they stand. Out here, control is not something you claim. It is something you prove by knowing when to do nothing at all. The call came just after 2 in the afternoon, right when the heat settles in and everything slows down whether you want it to or not. I was in the barn, checking a loose hinge on one of the interior gates, when my phone buzzed against the wooden workbench, vibrating just enough to echo through the quiet space. I did not rush to answer it. Out here, urgency is rarely real, and most problems solve themselves if you give them a minute. But when I picked it up and saw the number, I already knew where it was coming from. County office. I stepped outside into the light, letting the door swing shut behind me, and answered with a simple hello. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, the kind of tone people use when they are reading from something that matters. They had received a report. Large gathering. Possible safety concern. Unauthorized use of private land. I listened without interrupting, leaning against the barn post, eyes drifting out across the pasture that had already returned to its normal rhythm, like the morning had never happened. When they finished, I told them the truth. My property. No permits issued. No permission granted. Event concluded. Area secure. No injuries. No ongoing activity. There was a pause on the line, short but noticeable, like the person on the other end was adjusting their expectations. They asked if I had documentation. I looked out toward the east fence again, thinking about the camera feed sitting in my pocket, the clean timeline of everything that had taken place. I told them yes. Complete footage. Time-stamped. Clear view of entry points and activity. Another pause. Longer this time. Then a shift in tone. Not questioning anymore. Confirming. They thanked me and said someone might follow up, but it sounded more like a formality than a warning. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket without another thought. That is the thing about doing things the right way. You do not need to explain much when the facts are already in place. I walked back toward the fence line, not because I needed to check anything, but because routine matters after disruption. It tells the land, and yourself, that nothing permanent was taken from you. The air felt different now, cleaner, like whatever tension had built up earlier had been carried off with the last set of tires that left the property. I stopped near the gate and rested my hand on the top rail again, looking out across the same stretch of ground that had held 500 people just hours ago. It was quiet, not empty, just correct. A hawk circled overhead, slow and steady, scanning the field below with a kind of focus that does not waste energy. In the distance, one of the bulls moved toward the water line, unbothered, unchanged, exactly as it should be. That is how you know things are back where they belong. I took a slow breath and let it out, the kind that settles deeper than anything you can say out loud. Whatever report had been filed, whatever conversation was happening somewhere in an office miles away, it did not matter. Here, what mattered was that the land had not been taken. It had not been changed into something it was not. It had simply been reminded of its own boundaries, and it had responded the only way it knows how. I pushed off the fence and turned back toward the house, boots moving across familiar ground, each step steady, unhurried. Behind me, the pasture stretched out wide and open, untouched by anything that did not belong, holding its place the way it always had, long before anyone thought they could rewrite it with a sign and a crowd. By the time the sun started dropping behind the tree line, the pasture had fully settled into evening the way it always does, slow, steady, like nothing had ever tried to interrupt it. The light stretched long across the grass, turning every blade into something softer, something quieter, and the shadows from the fence posts lined up exactly the way I remembered from 100 evenings before. I walked out one last time, not because I needed to check anything, but because routine is what closes a day like this. The kind of routine that reminds you nothing was taken, nothing was lost, just tested. My boots pressed into ground that had already begun to rebound, the surface loosening where the weight had been too much earlier, the soil breathing again in its own way. I stopped near the center of the field and looked out across all 40 acres, letting the silence sit for a second, the real kind of silence that carries its own sound if you listen close enough. A fence creaked lightly in the distance. One of the bulls shifted near the water line, slow and deliberate, the same pattern it had followed for years. Everything was back where it belonged. That is how you know the day is over. Not by the clock, not by the light, but by the land returning to itself without resistance. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded sign I had taken down earlier, the one that tried to rename this place into something temporary, something borrowed. The paper was already soft at the edges from the heat and dust, the bold letters still clear, but meaningless now that they were no longer nailed to my fence. I turned it over once in my hands, then set it down on the tailgate of my truck without looking at it again. It did not belong out here, and it did not deserve to stay. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a vehicle passed on the county road. It sounded distant and brief, just part of the world outside my boundary lines. Inside those lines, everything held firm. That is the difference most people never understand. Ownership is not a piece of paper or a meeting vote. It is knowing exactly what something is, how it works, and what it needs to stay that way. Brenda thought control came from organizing people, from printing signs, from acting like authority could be created if you said it loud enough. But out here, authority does not come from volume. It comes